Management here at AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. I want to welcome everybody to webinar 16 in our Transportation Asset Management webinar series that has been sponsored by FHWA and AASHTO, I think for the past 3 years. Today's topic is on a Transportation Asset Management financial plan. This is the second of 2 financial plan asset management webinars that we've held. The first one we held was last fall of 2015, and that one 2014. That one was, yeah, it's not 2015 yet. Sorry, guys. That one was very popular, one of our most attended webinars, and we thought that it's important to have a second one to sort of go into some more detail about the topic of financial planning. We're happy to have the second one. This one did get delayed. It got postponed for some logistical reasons. So hopefully everybody can attend, or is attending that was going to attend back in June. We have been presenting these webinars about every 2 months, going back to 2012, on a variety of topics in asset management. And if you want to view those webinars, the previous recordings, PowerPoint presentations, etc., you can go to our TAM portal, which is at tam-portal.com. And from there, you can click on TAM events in the menu, and you'll see a link to register for all of these asset management webinars. Another way to get to the TAM portal is through the AASHTO's Subcommittee on Asset Management website, which is tam.transportation.org. It all goes to the same place. So there, as I said, you'll find archives of previous webinars, links to video, and slides from today's webinar will be posted on that site shortly. As I said, this is also the home of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management. If you want to learn more about the subcommittee, AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, you can go to the TAM portal website, and if you click on the About menu, there's a separate link for the subcommittee. I do want to say that the Subcommittee on Asset Management is going to be meeting in a couple weeks in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as part of another peer exchange and sort of workshop on asset management and risk management. We'll also be meeting at the AASHTO annual meeting later in September in Chicago, Illinois. So if you're interested and you're attending any of those meetings, please plan to join us. Those subcommittee meetings are open to the public. Very importantly, if you have any other suggestions on future webinar topics, or if you have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature. So if you do have a question, instead of raising your hand or waiting, just type it in there, and as the moderator, we'll be able to see those questions, and we will address them at the end. And if you have topics as you go through this webinar, or you're thinking about other webinars and topics that have happened, and you think it would be a good topic for a follow-up webinar, please include those in your comments, or you can email me them at mhardy@ashto.org. FHWA and AASHTO have agreed to continue these webinars for at least the next 2 years. So we have 12 more to do over the next 2 years, and we are looking for topics that we can include that are timely, and the states and the MPOs and the participants they think will find useful and valuable. And as I said, we will answer any questions at the end of the webinar today. In terms of phone logistics, throughout today's webinar, the audience will be muted by default, and only the presenters will be audible. That just helps logistically, and as people put us on hold and stuff like that, we won't hear their beautiful background music. Presenters should be sure to use their phone's mute buttons when you're not speaking, just as a reminder, and then unmute your phone when you do start speaking. So that covers sort of a brief intro and some of the overall logistics for today's webinar. And with that, I want to turn it over to Steve Gay of FHWA.
Good afternoon, good morning, and for Alan over in the UK, I'm going to say good evening. I'm Steve Gay, leader of Federal Highways Asset Management Team. Federal Highways, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management and the Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group, we're pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to bring people together on a series of important topics and connect with the asset management community. You know, this topic of financial plans. It's clearly addressed in the AASHTO Asset Management Guide. MAP 21 clearly said financial plans as part of the asset management framework. But what were we talking about? What was Congress talking about? What are the expectations? I think today's presenters will give some very good examples. We have presentations from Australia, the UK, and I believe Vermont talking about it. And Anna Taggett from Britain has a lot of experience. Know him from the participation in the Road Association, PIAC. The input of experiences from Britain and Australia. He may give some valuable insight of why this is so important. Because Australia even has a separate guide on financial plans. And the UK has one that the locals use. But it's a very important topic. We have a full agenda today. So I'm just going to say a few words. With this webinar, Asset Management, we reached our 16th webinar in our series. We turned to a topic that we first covered back in October 2014. That webinar provided an introduction to transportation asset management financial plans in the context of MAP 21. Today's will complement and expand on that previous webinar. It provides a follow-up that will highlight agency outcomes and lessons learned from developing an asset management financial plan. FHWA is working to help support agencies in this process. We have these webinars. We're also going to have a series of 5 publications that should be posted on our website, the first 2 or 3, within the next couple of weeks. We're also going to have a separate series of 5 webinars on this topic. Please visit FHWA Asset Management website. Like you see the previous 5 publications we had on risk management, asset management, these financial management publications will be posted similarly. Next, webinar overview. Today's webinar includes 3 perspectives on asset management. We'll hear from the U.S. Highway Agency in their asset management financial plan. Also explore the experiences of a couple agencies from abroad who I think are in the forefront of taking on these challenges. They're going to even address the issue of asset valuation. You often get the question, why asset valuation? And I was talking to another entity last week. They're saying the locals have really found it important as they've talked about asset management, financial plans, and risk, even with their bond rating, in a way of telling a story of what happens if. Presentations will highlight successful approaches and lessons learned, and I encourage you to follow up by visiting us online for more information. Visit the FHWA Asset Management website. I just want to say that I believe you're really going to enjoy today's presentation. Let me turn it to Yana Pat from Spy Pond Partners to give an overview of the webinar today, the agenda, and introduce our speakers. Yana?
Thanks, Steve. So the purpose of this webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to TAM financial plans, understanding specific approaches to developing a TAM financial plan in the context of MAP 21 requirements, and beginning to apply the knowledge in order to answer the following questions. How can a TAM financial plan help agencies manage the reality of uncertain funding? What are the key lessons learned for agencies just beginning to develop a TAM financial plan as part of their TAM program and the development of their transportation asset management plan? What benefits can states expect to achieve based on lessons learned from abroad? So turning to the agenda for today, we'll start off by hearing from, we started off by hearing from Matt and Steve, and then I'm going to introduce each of our speakers before each presentation. But in brief, our first presentation, we will hear long distance from Queensland, Australia, with a presentation from Andrew Golding. Next, we'll hear from the Vermont Agency of Transportation with a presentation from Chad Allen. And our final presentation, we'll hear from UK KPMG with a presentation from Alan Taggart. We'll have Q&A at the end, so just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar Q&A feature on the webinar menu bar at any time during the presentations, and we'll be taking the questions in the order that they're submitted after all the presentations have been completed. So let's shift to our first presentation will be from Andrew Golding. Andrew is the Director of the Transport System Asset Management with the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, Australia. Over the past 17 years, Andrew has been at the forefront of development of asset management capability, systems, information, and processes within the department, and is proud to be part of the ongoing asset management journey locally, nationally, and internationally. Due to the fact that it's 4 a.m. in Australia right now, Andrew has graciously agreed to pre-record this presentation. Now let's go to the video with Andrew.
I've already been through my bit about me, and I'll be talking today around the Queensland Department of Transport's approach to total asset management planning and linking to financial plans, and the accounting approach, infrastructure, our valuation method. In terms of overview, I'll spend a little bit of time just introducing the department and the state of Queensland. So firstly, to our values. In 2013, the Queensland Public Service launched new values to help revitalise our public service, and these values are customers first, putting ideas into action, unleashing potential, being courageous, and empowering people. At TMR, that's Transport and Main Roads, we're working hard to embed these values in our culture, and we're already working more collaboratively, productively, and smarter. I thought first, by way of introduction, it'd be worth sharing a few statistics about Queensland and our transport network. I thought I'd do this in comparison to some of the US states. At a population of 4.7 million, we're about the average size of a US state, around the median level there. Our road network, both state and locally controlled networks, is about 180,000 kilometres, and that would rank us about 12th overall in terms of US states. But we are quite a large state at nearly 1.9 million square kilometres. We're nearly 3 times the size of Texas. So that creates some challenges in itself. Our state-controlled network covers some 33,300 kilometres. We have around 3,000 bridges and 4,000 major culverts. So with a vast and diverse network and relatively small population, it creates an asset management challenge as we seek to provide appropriate and sustained level of service. We're also not immune to natural disasters. So adding to that challenge, we've had some frequent visitations of tropical cyclones, and rainfall associated with those events from 2010 through to 2013 resulted in extensive closures and substantial damage to the state road network. So funding for that repair bill, while there was a significant federal contribution, the state funds needed to be diverted from our normal construction and maintenance programs. Once again, there's a huge challenge to manage that level of repair bill through our normal programs. I'll step now into our financial planning processes for infrastructure operations and what it looks like. Now, the department operates on a portfolio basis with around 15 investment groups. So overall, the funding for the portfolio is negotiated with our federal government and with our state treasury. So this means that while we have no ability to directly raise revenue, we are able to work with our fund providers to agree on an indicative forward funding profile, and we document that in a document known as the Transport Infrastructure Portfolio Plan and Schedule, TIPS, and it includes our funded and unfunded priorities within an assumed funding envelope and timing of more significant investments within those candidates. We also have a a high level of surety around our immediate program, but the longer term planning is through the indicative funding profile. I think some of the key investment principles are worth touching on here, and by order of priority, they really run the system, so operating at appropriate levels of service, maintaining the system, focusing on repair or rehabilitation of the networks, and building the system, so incrementally investing for growth. And across all of those, there is a focus or principle of safety underpinning the decisions within those investments. That's a bit of a schematic as to what that might look like diagrammatically. Won't dwell further on that one. In terms of what that looks like in terms of our current 10-year funding outlook across all of our investment groups, you're not going to be able to see the detail there, but I'll highlight the lower two groupings cover our run the system and maintain the system. And I'll focus on those in a little bit more detail. So on our road operations and run the system, where despite the fact that we have an overall decline in our overall level of investment in those forward funding profiles, the operations component is steadily increasing through that time, recognising that we have a expanding asset base with our ITS and electrical systems, and that we still need to fund the power to our lighting infrastructure and against steadily increasing electricity charges. Likewise, for our maintenance of the system, which is our maintenance, preservation and environment investment group, we're steadily increasing over the system, making sure that we're trying to attain sustainable levels of investment in our current network. The next section I want to talk about is around our asset management planning. Firstly, I'd like to say we have a fairly strong capability around our tactical and operational asset management planning. We have systems that feed through the development of our programs and through to delivery. But the focus of this presentation is on our strategic asset management plans. So that's the areas that I highlighted there in that overall framework, which I presume you'll all be familiar with. In terms of some of the critical components that go into the establishment of our plans, obviously they're driven by our service standards, but they're evidentiary based, so we're using our inventory and condition assessments, the network standards, our performance modelling, plus deficiency analysis and our valuation processes to inform the development of our asset management plans. So our first initial asset management plan was developed in 2011. It was restricted to our road and busway networks, including structures. It was based on the IPWEA NAMS Plus approach. IPWEA is our Institution of Public Works Engineers Australia, and NAMS, the National Asset Management System that's been developed by IPWEA. It's also worth noting that in Queensland, local governments are required to prepare asset management plans for infrastructure assets to assist in planning to manage assets sustainably, and they need to be linked to their 10-year finance plans. And it's also worth noting the Queensland Government is now implementing a total asset management framework across all state government departments, and we're in an initial trial period now across 6 agencies. I'll talk a little bit about our methodologies that go into preparing both the 2011 and the current planning process. So our objectives linked to current condition, risks, strategies, and our funding profile and future asset needs. Within the plan, we seek to summarise our current and predicted levels of service and performance targets. We're looking at the overall funding outlook, about 20 years, and our investment needs and priorities that are projected within our system. We're going to look at what the funding shortfall is and provide an assessment as to how sustainable our current plan is. We also look at what the consequences are from a financial perspective in terms of our value and depreciation. And in both our current and the 2011 plan, the plan doesn't fully close that funding gap, but we look at the options for closing that gap. So we couldn't say that it's a complete asset management plan at this point in time because of that funding and performance gap that still exists. So in terms of the 2011 methodology, as we said, this was developed in accordance with the FHWA approach, and those core components are looking at asset life cycles, using the best current available information, looking at our current levels of service and doing some simple risk assessment to focus on those critical issues. And obviously a key part to that is looking at our long-term financials and our level service targets and how we close that gap. So within our current draft plan, obviously there's a huge difference, and I think most areas will be experiencing a huge difference between what our unconstrained view might be of a sustained asset base with sustained levels of service and where we're currently funded. Now, in terms of expressing that within our current plan, we've actually taken a moderated view, which seeks to close some of that funding gap, but also looks at where we would tolerate deficiencies in the assets going forward, and so lower than the required levels of service. In terms of how that gap analysis works, we've defined our levels of service through some of our high-level strategies, through moving freight and moving people strategies, and looked at the service delivery components that are aligned to those levels of service, and set them out according to some deficiencies that we measure against those levels of service. I won't go into that in too much detail. And in terms of some of the outputs, we can express the deficiency from a financial perspective against our various asset components, and this is showing schematically where that's falling. Our major deficiencies at this point in time relate to mainly our life cycle risks for our road surfaces and structures and major culverts. We've also provided asset value projections within our current plan, and that's showing that under the current scenario, the planned values are declining, but under the proposed or moderated view, we'll be increasing overall value over time. Talked a little bit about asset sustainability ratio. This is a key indicator that we use as part of our annual report, and it's a measure that sets out how we're investing relative to the rate that the asset is being consumed, measured through depreciation. You'd appreciate that you need to have a very good process for determining depreciation if you're using it as part of the measure of sustainability. So that's what I'll focus on for the next part of the session, is our valuation process, which provides us what we think is a very rigorous method of determining our levels of depreciation on an ongoing basis. So for infrastructure. So, as I said, I believe a robust valuation process is the key to tying together our asset management planning for maintenance and renewals with the long-term financial outlook. So firstly, I'll get into some of the detail here around how we componentise our assets. Our major components are our roads and structures. Within the roads, we break them down to our surface components, so both the chip seal, asphalt surfaces, drainage and minor culverts are included in our pavement components, and our formation is basically the earthworks. Within the structures, once again, they're broken down by bridges, major culverts and tunnels and other special structures. We also include in the valuation process capital works in progress each year. Our methodology, this is a bit of a schematic overview of that methodology. I'll drill into some of the details as we go. But the key components are the extraction of our inventory details, undertaking our remaining useful life analysis using our payment management systems and other systems, having a good depreciation model, undertaking our assessments of any impairment, applying residual value where warranted, and a process of arriving at fair value through a stereotype approach for our road network. So I'll start on that stereotype approach. So we have a gross value determined in dollars per square metres. The stereotype basically uses resource-based replacement costs for the network, and it's a transparent and repeatable and efficient process. Into some of the detail there, so we have work breakdown structures or schedules covering a range of our capital works programs for each stereotype, and each stereotype is then adjusted according to the terrain, the environment, and the region that it's in. And a significant input to that overall process is market input costs for labour, plant, and materials, and covering basically at a basic costing level. We develop the cost for each of those stereotypes. So in terms of those work breakdown structure schedules, we have around 194 schedules covering our capital upgrade components, and another 335 schedules covering our renewal or rehabilitation type activities. And they feed into that unit cost component within our valuation methodology. I won't dwell too long on our inventory extraction method, but we have quite a detailed asset information system. It's not a purist asset register as such, but each year we extract and emulate an asset register from that detailed asset management system. And there's a whole range of activities that go on to validate information and certify its completeness. Our remaining useful life analysis, well, this is really a key part to making sure we have a strong link between our financial management and our asset management approach. We're using the same analysis that we undertake for our tactical asset management planning in determining the useful life of our different components within the road bridge assets. And once again, I mean, they're the standard components that you'd see in a payment management system, where we have deterioration models, performance targets, utilisation data, environmental data, costs and conditions. Our depreciation models, once again, that's I guess a fundamental component to any valuation process. Generally, we're using a straight line apart from our assets, where we have a increasing depreciation model based on the change in the heavy vehicle loading over the life of the asset. I've talked to that already, so it's an increasing consumption model effectively for our pavements and straight line for the rest. We also need to assess impairment. And obviously with the significant flood damage, there's often a high level of impairment assessed after those disasters have occurred and before the repairs are undertaken. So just to round this off in terms of why we're valuing assets, certainly we have Treasury policy that directs us to that, and it's a key input to our financial statements. But ultimately, it really is best practice from an asset management perspective, linking our sustainable and renewal and replacement strategies to our longer term financial outlook. I guess in terms of the other benefits there, obviously being able to provide strong justification in funding submissions and be able to talk to our road funders in a way that they can understand is an important component. It enables reporting in monetary terms of how the physical condition of the network is changing, and it's also an important component in our asset management approach. And as I mentioned before, it provides that detailed input to our key financial sustainability indicators, asset sustainability ratio, consumption ratio, and renewal funding ratio. I won't talk to those in too much detail, other than to say that the sustainability ratio is looking at that replacement or renewal funding for the existing asset compared to the consumption of its service potential measured through depreciation. The asset consumption ratio is indicating how far through the life of an asset we are from a financial perspective. It's showing book value relative to gross value. And the asset renewal funding ratio is looking at our current long-term financial outlook with our projected capital renewal aspirational figures. So this is going beyond what we measure in depreciation, but also including the strengthening and widening of our assets to meet future demand. So that really brings it to a close in terms of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. While I may not be able to make it live, I'm certainly, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer those on notice. Thank you.
All right, thank you to Andrew from cyberspace. All right, our next presentation from Chad Allen of the Vermont Agency of Transportation addresses the Vermont Transportation Asset Management Financial Plan. Chad is the Director of the Asset Management and Performance Bureau, or the AMP, at VTrans. Now I'll turn it over to Chad.
Thank you very much. As Hannah said, I'm the Director of the Asset Management Performance Bureau for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And today we're going to talk to you, give you a status update on our Transportation Asset Management Financial Plan. Next slide, please. So just kind of stepping backwards a little bit, our Transportation Asset Management Plan has been under development since about December 2013. We meet roughly every 2 weeks and continue to meet. The work group is composed of about 27 people from all different kinds of areas. Some are asset stewards or program managers, directors or deputy chief engineers. We have representation from the different modes, rail, air, public transit, and we have a local representation from our Federal Highway Division also on that group. Next slide, please. We've compartmentalized our TAMP work group into 9 different task forces. each of them led by different personnel within the agency. Our 9 task forces span our asset management processes or business modules, customer service levels, data. Obviously, our financial plan is a separate task force and includes our investment strategies. Each of these task forces encompasses a different chapter within our transportation asset management plan. And each of the task forces have been charged to go out and get other folks involved within the agency as a way to broaden influence, but also to increase our asset management culture, performance management, risk management cultures within the agency, and to grow that. Next slide, please. So who's on our financial plan task force? Well, the team leader actually is Costa Pappas, and he is one of our transportation planners, and he's actually the team lead. And Costa's done a really good job with this group in leading us down a path where we're just about ready to write our chapter, write our financial plan and include that as a chapter in our TAM. And Costa's expertise is that he's getting ready to embark on a long-range transportation plan now, and so it's maybe perhaps for a little bit of selfish reasons, but a lot of this work here that we're doing with the financial plan is going to be used to inform the long-range transportation plan as well. And as you can see on the slide, we've got a lot of different folks involved in the financial plan. We have our CFO, our pavement and bridge management specialists, our fixed asset accountant, our team lead there, our director of our policy planning and intermodal development bureau, our budget and programming manager for assets, and we're also using Gordon Proctor Associates as a consultant to help out here as well. Next slide, please. And the next few slides, the next 3 slides actually are highlight kind of our work breakdown structure, if you will, from our work plan that we're following to develop our transportation asset management plan. And we've got 15, 16 or so different elements of our financial plan. Some of them are a little bit generic, and other ones, I'm going to highlight a few of those for you today before we move on and talk about revenue forecast and revenue sources and projected asset conditions and such as that. So on this slide, I'd like to just pull out or highlight the fact that we're looking at historic funding levels and future revenue projections for our NHS pavements and bridges. We're also looking to document what our process is for allocating funds between program areas, identify some of those long-term investment needs and strategies, and we're looking at providing a comparison of condition data and corresponding needs to comparing those back to our actual funding levels and projected funding levels. Next slide. So a couple things I wanted to point out here is the words asset valuation and asset depreciation. I guess to be politically correct, asset valuation has been a topic that's been enthusiastically discussed at some of our meetings, and there's definitely maybe the word is not necessarily ready to be embraced at VTrans at this point. I think I got a lot more work to do to convince folks that we need to take a little bit harder look at this as we push forward the principles of performance management. I can see where we would be looking at some of the financial metrics that Andrew talked about, the asset sustainability ratio, the asset consumption ratio, the asset renewal ratio, and looking at these as a way to measure how we're doing. And the thought at VTrans, at least with asset valuation, is, you know, it's a good communication tool, but hey, I'm not going to change my accounting practices just so you can communicate more effectively with the public. So I'm certainly interested in finding ways to promote the change towards asset valuation, as I think it is a valuable tool, messaging tool. So some of our challenges with the TAMP, but also with the specifics of the financial plan, is that we're really trying to support a lot of different initiatives and trying to understand how these different initiatives complement each other and how they can be placed in sync or aligned with each other to support strategic goals and objectives that we have. Next slide, please. So this is our last slide for kind of essentially the work elements for our financial plan task force, and I included them all just so folks can go back to them and refer to them in more detail. On this slide, I just want to point out kind of the 10-year planning horizon for our financial plan, and I think the one thing that strikes me about that horizon is the more that we work with condition projections and revenue projections, and I guess probably the older I get, 10 years goes by pretty quickly. So I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable working with a longer time frame and almost kind of feeling that as a necessity as we head down the path of financial planning. And I mentioned earlier that the cost is doing a 25-year long-range transportation plan, and in some of our analysis that I'll show you, we do have some 20-year projections out there on some stuff, and I think it's just interesting how I've been hearing a lot on the performance management front about the long-range transportation plan and the linkages to our asset management plan. I really think that the financial plan for asset management can really be a springboard, and the two of those plans can really work together. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share with you folks a couple of influential documents and policies at VTrans. The first one is our, and I should probably predicate this on, I wanted to include another policy in here. It's called the Road to Affordability, but I couldn't find a cover page for that. But essentially, our Road to Affordability was issued in 2006, and as we'll see in a later slide, it really kind of focused us on asset management. And a lot of a couple of these reports here really came on the heels of this Road to Affordability, which was shifting our agency's focus from the capital improvement, constructing roads perspective to more of a maintaining our highway and preservation focus. And so a couple of these documents here, the Section 40 report on the right, that was established by our transportation committees in our legislature, and the folks that worked on this were charged with estimating the gap between the revenue sources and our actual cost to maintain, operate, and build a transportation system. And the one on the left is our long-term assessment funding options for bridges and culverts. And I think one of the things to point out as we're kind of coming into the developing the TAMP work group, and we're looking at the different pieces that had to come along, our financial plan was really, this area was really looked as a weakness, and we really thought we needed to get out and get some other folks involved in this, and we brought Gordon Shobna from Gordon Proctor Associates into this, and they're very helpful in getting us together and organized and understanding providing some guidance for us. But this really ended up being a strength for us because we had these documents out there and nobody really knew of them. So there was this, I guess, maybe traditional disconnect between planning and the operational side of things, where we had a lot of some documents out there but not widely distributed and the content was not widely utilized once past this report. So it ended up being a strength for us. And I mentioned that the Section 40 report identified a $240 million gap, or maybe I didn't mention the number, but it was a $240 million gap between our revenue sources and our needs. And it provided an indicator that we had an asset sustainability ratio of about 0.67. Next slide, please. From the Section 40 report, what came out of that was we sought a revenue bill and obtained a 5.9% increase on our gasoline tax. And as you can see from this graphic, well, actually not from this one. It's this one. There we go. Okay, there we are. So this slide here, you can see that Vermont really relies heavily on our automobile user fees and the gasoline tax. The TIB fund of 9%, that is actually pennies on a gallon tax paid by our fuel distributors. And so we rely heavily on the gasoline tax for revenue, and Vermont might be in a unique situation as some states across the country, but our VMT actually declined in the past year or so, and we're a green state, so we really treasure the environment, and in this environment of more hybrid vehicles and fuel efficiencies and our VMT dropping, our revenue's dropping as well, and so that's something that we need to be aware of as we're putting the financial plan together. Next slide, please. This slide and the next slide, what I wanted to show was it's a spreadsheet, and so you have the first half of the top of the spreadsheet in front of you, and what this actually represents is money coming in. And we did 3 scenarios. We did a 0, 1, and 2% growth for our funding projections. This slide here actually shows the 2% growth scenario. So for funding coming in from the National Highway Performance Program, it's a 2% increase each federal fiscal year. And then at the bottom, we see the total available funding ranging from $493 million in 2014 to $505 million in 2016. Next slide, please. So these funding projections were carried out over a 20-year period. This is the bottom half of that spreadsheet, and it represents money leaving the barn. So it's been adjusted. We accounted for inflation by taking the adjusted needs, third from the bottom, and adjusting for inflation there. And we're reporting an adjusted unmet need ranging from $206 million in 14 to $236 million in 16, and this is carried out for 20 years to about FY 2035. And our assets to sustainability went from 0.7 in 2014 to 0.68 in 2016. And it's just coincidence that the asset sustainability index that we're reporting in 16 and the unmet need of 240 million are closely similar to the Section 40 report. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you what our asset sustainability index was looking like projected out over this 20-year analysis period for the 3 different funding scenarios. And you can see the blue represents a 2% growth rate. It's keeping up a little bit better with the unmet needs, but it's still dropping. And the green represents a 0 growth rate, and we're falling below 0.5 for the asset sustainability index. Like as I mentioned before, we recognize that we have a revenue need there, and are going to be working with our legislatures this year to try to get more money, more revenue in. But I think that this graphic also shows the decline in purchasing power over time that we're facing as a state agency, which is the benefits of looking at a longer time horizon. In 10 years, you can see it from 2015 to 2025, but it's really even more pronounced when you go out 20 years. So some of the benefits of a longer time horizon there. Next slide, please. What we're showing here is our current pavement conditions, and I just want to point out that it's an unweighted condition. And you can see we went back in time about 10 years to show you what our pavement condition was in 2003. Our road affordability kicked in around 2006, and we have a performance goal of less than or equal to 25% very poor condition. So we're meeting our target now, and when you meet your targets, you automatically get the question, well, how come you need more money for payments? Because you're meeting your performance goal. And so one of the values of this financial plan for us is to show that, while yes, we're meeting our goal now, it's not going to stay that way, because here's what the projected future condition looks like. There was a significant drop in our percent very poor between 2012 and 2014, primarily because we spent about $14 million on what we call a district leveling treatment, which is just a leveling treatment that's going to last 3 to 5 years. So we've got a lot of pavements that we treated between around 2013, 2014 timeframe that are going to be coming back in the system as poor and very poor very shortly. Next slide, please. On our pavement budget scenarios, looking at forecasting pavement condition, we generated 7 scenarios, and the one in the middle, the $100 million scenario, is the one that's more applicable to what we are currently experiencing for our funding level now. You'll note that not all the money under the funding distribution adds up to the $100 million. We took $5 million out of that funding distribution to cover overhead costs and PE and some stuff like that. So with this payment budget scenario, we use our date and DTIM software, and we use a 4% discount rate, which I believe is fairly standard. Next slide, please. This slide looks a lot like the slide from 2 slides ago. However, this is actually the weighted condition distribution based on a $100 million budget projected out for the next 15 years. I just cut it off at 15 years. It did go all the way out to 2035. The weighted condition piece just talks about ranking the volume or weighting the volume, traffic volumes on certain roads. And our performance metric here is to attain 70% good and fair roads. And you can see that we're attaining that metric now. We're just about just over 70% right now. And based on a $100 million budget being applied consistently on an annual basis, you can see that we can maintain that target. It slips from us a little bit, but then we get it back and can hold it for a period of time. Next slide, please. So this is the unweighted payment condition distribution for the $100 million budget, and you can see, oops, we go back to that one slide. And you can see that what happens here is we're doing okay, but then we lose the percent very poor, gets out of control for us in out years. Okay, next slide, please. This is what I'm going to refer to as our Christmas graph. What it does for us here is it takes both of the performance measures and we look at a consistent level of spend, and we have those 7 scenarios that we looked at, and so we got 7 points for each of these graphs. And the left side is our unweighted payment condition, and you can see how the payments condition improves as we spend more money each year. And with our weighted condition average, you can see also how that improves with more money. What this tells us essentially is that we're looking at roughly about $107 million investment over the course of 20 years consistently in order to attain both of our performance goals. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to show here that it's got both of the performance metrics on there. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, our bridges. So for our bridges here, this one's not by deck area. I think we'll get to the deck area in the next slide, but this just shows you the number of structural deficient bridges that we had in Vermont in 2004, 2009, and 2014, and it shows you that what our performance goals are for each of our programs, our interstate program, our state highway program, intertown highway program, as well as our state shorts. One of the changes for us in communicating our message to the public is not talking about the age of our infrastructure. We have a lot of old bridges in Vermont, but rather focusing on the condition. It seems rather obvious, but when your message has continually evolved around, oh, this bridge is 150 years old and this one's 100 years old, well, we're still maintaining those bridges and they're still in service, which, by the way, poses some interesting asset valuation questions from the replacement value and depreciation side of things. Next slide, please. This is a map or a graphic of our structurally deficient deck area, and with a couple of timeline things mapped down there. You can see our 2006 road to affordability policy that kicked in. Just to kind of give you a point of reference here, the The dashed yellow, blue, and green lines represent our budget for our different bridge programs. The blue is our interstate program, the yellow is our Time Highway Bridge program, and the green is our State Highway Bridge program. The full red line represents the summation of those dashed lines added up, as well as our bridge maintenance budget. As you can see, our bridge maintenance budget has been zero for a while. It's really kind of an inactive program, but I'm showing that on there for future budget discussions here at VTrans. The solid green, yellow, and blue lines, those are the conditions for each of the collective bridges within those programs. And on the left are the dollars that we've investing in the programs by the dashed lines, and on the right y-axis is an inverted structurally deficient deck area by percent. So 0% is at the top rather than being at the bottom. And what this shows is with an increasing investment, which is somewhat linear, a little bit exponential due to the tropical storm we had in 2011, but we can kind of see a relationship between our funding levels and our progress towards decreasing our structural deficient deck area. Next slide, please. Rather than just call this future directions, I wanted to kind of show really what we're talking about in Vermont right now with asset management is framework versus a well-oiled machine. And the graphic to the left really kind of highlights it for us. Is we've got a lot of initiatives out there. We're trying to set a lot of different stuff up. We're trying to align things, trying to support a lot of different things, and there's a lot of moving pieces. Some things are in motion, and we're trying to sync them up with some other things. But a couple of these are our life cycle cost analyses and budget alignment, which we're working on right now. Next slide, please. So from a budget alignment perspective, our AMP budget and programming section has been tasked with developing budgetary targets for our highway division, which essentially is most of the assets that the agency controls. And so this is significant because this is the section that is being charged with credible programming. And when we have maintenance activities, we need to make sure that we're doing the proper maintenance to extend our service lives, and we want to make sure that the funding is there to do those activities. Budget alignments is one of the things we're working on. Next slide, please. Life cycle costs analysis. Let's go to, there we go. Life cycle cost analyses or life cycle cost considerations is another area that we're spending a lot of time in, and I think this is one of the areas that we need some assistance, some guidance on perhaps. I took this graphic off the web. I thought it was interesting because I typically see a lot of different life cycle cost and pavement deterioration models for pavements. I haven't seen too many for bridges, and so we're going to be using this to kind of help guide some of our life cycle cost analyses for our bridge management system that we're working on now. And so just kind of thinking about how we might use life cycle cost analyses for VTrans. I think where we're at right now is we're going to use some sort of life cycle cost analysis, whether it's benefit cost analysis for treatment selection. And then once we've determined the treatment and the scopes of those treatments and schedule and costs get turned into projects, then we're going to start thinking about what are the value of those projects towards our transportation goals, and system values, and look at optimizing the rate of return on that investment, and as a way to see which ones we're going to move forward with and do in which years. Next slide. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and be willing to happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Chad. And yes, please, if you have any questions for Chad, please enter them into the Q&A box. Our next presentation is from Alan Taggart of UK KPMG. Alan is going to speak to us about the TAM financial planning in the UK. Alan is a chartered engineer with over 25 years of experience in highway maintenance and asset management, both in the UK and overseas. He's an Associate Director with KPMG Asset Management Advisory Services based in London, UK.
Right, hello, and thank you. And thanks to the previous presenters. I'm obviously going to talk about the UK experience of financial planning, and I'm going to talk about it really from a high-level context. I will give a case study at the end of how we apply financial planning, but one of the things that I would like to do is really put it in context in terms of where UK government is at the moment and where our funding body, that's the Department of Transport, is at the moment, because they very much drive the approach we adopt to asset management. Next slide, please. So, asset management is fundamentally important in financial planning, and the key thing is in the UK is government does recognise this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the government approach. I'm going to talk about what are financial plans, the key attributes of those financial plans and the approach we currently adopt in the UK. And perhaps the most important challenge we have in the UK is actually making investment or making the case for investment, because it's very well having financial plans, but the key challenge is actually getting those matched or funding committed to actually deliver those plans. And that only works if the plans are robust and meaningful and actually attract stakeholder attention. Next slide, please. So the starting point in the UK is we have a number of standards that we actually adopt to deliver asset management. And the UK highway network comprises principally what we call the strategic road network and then the local road network. The strategic network is directly funded by government, that's central government, and in England, that's the Department of Transport. The UK does comprise three other nations, which are Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Transportation is a devolved power to those countries, so the approach is adopted is slightly different, so I'm not going to go into that. But what I'm going to talk about now is the standards that we adopt on the UK road network. We recognise PAS 55, which has now been superseded by ISO 55000 as the generic standard for asset management, and a lot of the approaches we adopt, in particular in the strategic road network, actually tie into those documents. If we look at the local road network, we have a number of other guidance documents that support asset management. We have what is called the Highway Infrastructure Asset Management, which is specific guidance for highway authorities and how to deliver asset management. It's based around the PAS 55 framework, but actually applies it to the highway network in particular. That document is freely available on the internet. We also have what we call the Transport Infrastructure Asset Guidance, which is about valuing highway assets. And I was very interested to hear the previous speaker talk about highway asset valuation, how that's been used in the States. We certainly use it in the UK, both for the strategic road network and the local road network. Asset valuation has its own challenges, particularly in terms of making it meaningful in terms of engineering parameters. So the local road network also adopts codes of practice, which are on the bottom of that slide, and we have codes of practice for highways, for structures, and also for lighting and electronic traffic equipment. So that's basically how the road network is made up and how it's funded. In addition to that, we also have what we call PFI schemes, which is Private Finance Initiative. These are actually 30-year concessions, which include both the strategic road network and the local road network. It is particularly in those concessions that financial planning and performance-based contracts have really been applied, and a lot of the approaches to asset management have actually been developed in the UK. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, government, central government that is, recognises the importance of asset management, both at a strategic level and a local level. As a consequence, there's been a number of government level documents that have been produced by government supporting the implementation of asset management. So the key thing is, and the really positive thing in the UK, is that generally government gets asset management and government gets the benefits of asset management, and I think that's a really important point. The real challenge comes at how asset management is actually then implemented at both a national road level and a local road level, and that's really where the challenge starts, and that's really where the case for funding has to be made to central government. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram we use in the UK. It has asset management at the centre, and on the outer parts of the triangle, it comprises three parts, which are funding, that's investment, and actually the case for investment in the road network, efficiency, and communications. And when we talk about communications, what we're effectively talking about is how road authorities communicate with the stakeholders at the travelling public and how central government communicates with stakeholders. And again, the previous speaker mentioned communication as being an important part, and indeed it's also an important part in the UK in terms of getting stakeholder buy-in, both at national level and local level, and asset management is a key enabler for that. But actually perhaps focusing on the other two parts, which are funding and efficiency, one of the things that I haven't heard in the previous two presentations is actually, and I may have missed it, is actually the word efficiency. In the UK, government at the moment is about efficiency, and it's about driving down the national debt. So any funding in terms of highway maintenance, indeed funding in terms of any other part of the government, the quid pro quo in terms of that funding is actually how much efficiency is that organisation going to deliver in terms of funding they receive. And therefore, again, financial planning is a really important part of that, and in particular how funding is actually committed over longer term. Giving a real example of that is that the Strategic Road Authority in England, it was called the Highways Agency. Some of you may have heard of that. They've now changed the name to Highways England, and they've become what we call a semi-regulated company. That is, they're owned by government, but actually they've got regulatory controls on them. Government has actually given the Highways England £15 billion to spend over the next 5 years. And in terms of giving that long-term commitment to funding, which goes over one parliament in the UK, it's all about delivering additional efficiency. And asset management and financial plans are key to delivery. Next slide, please. So when we look at financial planning on itself, financial planning is used essentially in the UK to make the case for funding. It's used to support budget setting and actually to ensure that benefits are actually delivered from that funding. There's no standard approach for development of financial plans, although there is a standard model for the development of financial plans, which I'll talk about in a minute. And therefore, there's different levels of financial planning within different organisations. The short-term financial planning, medium-term financial planning, and long-term financial planning. And it's really the element of long-term financial planning that we in the UK also use similar tools that the previous speaker has talked about. But we also have a framework for highway asset management in the UK. It comprises 4 parts. Essentially a context of how asset management and highway maintenance is delivered, which is essentially about government policy, an asset management planning process, which sets out a policy, a strategy, performance requirements, the data required for delivery, the approach to life cycle planning or financial planning, and the development works programs. There are also a series of enablers that actually support the implementation and planning process. And for example, one of those key enablers is all about leadership and organisation, which is actually a key part of ISO 55000, but also a key part of the local authority local authority asset management framework. The other thing to take note of is that actually the financial plans that are generated from that framework are very much used then to deliver procurement and service delivery. So it's very much about understanding what your asset is, understanding the financial planning required for that asset over the next 10 to 15 years, and then getting the right procurement model in order to deliver that and deliver the efficiencies that government requires. Next slide, please. So essentially in the UK, a financial plan comprises details of funding required to deliver a work plan, including amount needed to sustain current enhanced levels of performance. Again, there's no particular performance standard that's adopted in the UK. It's really how much money do I have and what performance do I get. The breakdown of the financial plan should align with work types and volumes. The plan should also include the impact of different levels of funding and the network performance using whole life costing and so forth. I think that's probably, from what I've heard from the other speakers, a well understood concept. However, a sound process of financial planning is also critical to form the basis of securing necessary funds and setting budgets. So financial planning needs to be real, it needs to be something that stakeholders understand, and it needs to come up with realistic figures. And I'll give you an example of that. I don't quite know where you are for states and the concept of backlog and so forth, but certainly in the UK, we use the concept of maintenance backlog, and the maintenance backlog for the local roads in the UK is about £15 billion. When us as engineers start banding around £15 billion, in all honesty, we lose interest from government, we lose interest from stakeholders, because they don't really believe that's a real sum of money we need to invest in the road network. So the point is that in terms of financial planning, what we need to do is make sure that those sums are kept real, that they're meaningful, and actually stakeholders see them as being realistic. They understand the benefits and are prepared to buy into them. But also, as I said earlier, what we do is develop financial planning for both the short, medium and longer term periods of asset maintenance, and I'm going to touch on some of that later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So a good financial plan will consider the benefit and impact on the economics. Is there a reward for the organisation providing well-maintained roads that will support economic growth? So if you like, the rate of return on investment is really important, and how that is measured. Again, in the UK, we don't have a specific model for measuring economics in highway maintenance. Obviously, the World Bank and the World Road Association have HDM4, which some of you might be familiar with. That's a tool that's used to measure economic benefit. Therefore, economic benefit is measured very much on a bespoke basis, how and why organisations see it as being important and how they measure it. A good financial plan will also consider the impact of asset value, and again, the previous speaker talked about that. But again, depending on the accountancy rules used in the organisation, asset valuation or asset value may be important, it may not be important. The time in the UK when we have found it important is when organisations need to fund depreciation. So if you don't maintain your asset in a steady state, if actually your asset depreciates, then under certain accountancy rules, that depreciation needs to be funded from revenue funding. But revenue funding has to be budgeted for in the financial plan. So that's where asset valuation becomes important. If you don't fund depreciation as part of asset valuation, then accountants very quickly tend to lose interest. A good financial plan should also look at future performance. Is it the performance about protecting engineering integrity of the structure, or is it about maintaining resilience, or is it meeting stakeholder requirements? What are we actually trying to achieve from our levels of service? So depending on the financial constraints, including investment and accountancy rules for the organisation, the importance of financial planning actually may vary. But most often, it's the future performance and customer experience that are actually key considerations in selling the financial plan or making the case for funding. Next slide, please. So commitment to funding is a really important aspect, and when I talk about commitment to funding, that's really what I mean is ring-fence funding for a period of time, normally up to 5 years. I guess like the States, and I'm not quite sure how it works there, but certainly in the UK, highways are predominantly delivered from a public sector environment. And part of the issue with public sector is funding tends to be annualised, i.e. budgets are set from one year to the next year, and therefore long-term commitment to funding the highway asset is not often there. So we can do all the financial planning we like in the UK, but if we don't have that committed funding for delivering it, then it ceases to become relevant, in all honesty. So government certainly recognises annualisation of funding for highways as being a challenge. So as a consequence, government's done two things in the UK to support the highway sector. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, Highways England has become if you like, a government-owned company, and the government has committed a funding package of 15 billion years over the next 5 years to that company, and that money is ring-fenced. That means government will not be able to dip in and dip out of it as they see fit, or turn it off and turn it on. That funding is backed by an Act of Parliament that's called the Infrastructure Act. At local levels, government has also committed a 6-year funding package to local highway authorities, but is on a similar basis. And what government very much sees is by committing funding, by enabling local highway authorities and Highways England to develop a long-term approach to financial planning, government will actually deliver efficiency. So, as I said earlier, Highways England has got a 20% efficiency target that has to deliver that committed funding. Local authorities have a 10% committed efficiency target that they have to deliver with that funding. So financial planning and funding and efficiency all come hand in hand. Next slide, please. So just going on to the more technical aspects of what we do in the UK, if that was very much setting it, the context and the challenge in hand, when we actually look at the more detailed or engineering level about the challenges that we have in delivering financial plans, then they're very common to those you have in the States or those you have in Australia. The starting point is asset data. You know, you cannot make sound investment decisions, you cannot deliver sound financial plans unless you have confidence in the data that you have to deliver that. So in the UK, we started to develop quite a number of sophisticated techniques for actually collecting data. We now use LiDAR, which is ground-based LiDAR, and you'll see this diagram or this slide shows some of those images that actually give a proper 3G locational, that's XYZ, position of highway assets. It gives a 3G imagery. From it, you can start to determine not only location, but condition of all highway assets, including structures, pavements, and ancillary assets from the same source. So that's something that's very much under development in the UK, but certainly it's about collecting more and more data more and more often so we get a better picture for actually the condition of the asset. Once we get a better picture of the condition, we then start to be able to develop more robust financial plans. Next slide, please. Equally, this slide particularly focuses on pavements, which I know so mainly talk about when it comes to asset management, but again, certainly in the UK, we've developed a surface measurement called TRACS, which has been in place for about 10 years now, and it's quite sophisticated. What Highways England are also doing is developing a traffic speed deflectograph, which is shown there in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. So very much in the UK, we're looking at sophistication of measurement of data in order to get a better picture of performance, get a better picture of performance with greater confidence in terms of deterioration modelling and our financial planning going forward. Next slide, please. So those methods of collecting data were very much used by Highways England at a strategic level. At a local level, the challenge of developing deterioration models for all assets, not only pavements, but also structures and what we call roadside assets or ancillary assets, has really been delivered in the last couple of years. What's happened at local level is that the Department for Transport, through what we call the Highway Maintenance Efficiency Programme, has actually delivered a common life cycle and financial planning tool that's accessible to all local authorities in the UK. And this financial planning tool is very much used as a basis for developing financial plans and for local highway authorities committing funding to the network going forward. So at a local level in the UK, we've very much delivered a common approach within reason to financial planning using a common tool that develops common understanding and common learning between local authorities. That tool is called the Lifecycle Planning Toolkit. It comes with its own deterioration models, and that tool is actually freely accessible to anyone. The hyperlink that you can download it from is given there on the slide, so anyone can go in and look at it and play with it and tinker with it and start developing their own deterioration models and financial plans, but it comes from a common framework which is shown on the left-hand side there. Next slide, please.
Alan, I just wanted to interrupt to say that you have about 5 more minutes.
Right, okay, no, that's fine.
Okay,
next slide.
Thanks.
Right, so bear in mind the time constraints. I think the previous spoker showed a similar slide to this, and in fact, we have similar tools. We use DTIMs, we use other tools in the UK to actually determine long-term financial planning, and it's very much a similar process that we adopt using accurate data, deterioration modelling, and tools like DTIMs and other tools to actually determine long-term financial plans, primarily for pavements. Next slide, please. And from those, obviously, we can clearly predict what budget we currently have and what budget we require to maintain a level of service. And from that, we very much build up the case for investment. This is an example of road pavements. Next slide, please. This is an example of what we do for structures. And the previous speaker talked about structures, and I don't have much time, so I'll touch on it very quickly. The challenge in the UK around structures is that reactive maintenance has been used traditionally to maintain structures. What we're doing is moving into more of a preventative and predictive maintenance approach using deterioration modelling and using tools. Again, these tools are freely accessible from websites, and they can be used to start to predict the future condition of bridge stock and start to manage those risks and actually indeed predict the funding required. Next slide, please. And this slide shows what we do for roadside assets, which adopts a similar approach. Next slide, please. So those are very much about long-term financial planning. We also adopt what we call a medium-term financial plan, which is up to 5 years, which is really a rolling programme of works and what's required of the network, and it's very much prioritised on a bottom-up basis. And it's a process that we use in England that's called the value management process. And this slide shows how that works, but it's very much based around bottom-up schemes and doesn't really involve the predictive modelling we might be using for long-term financial planning. Next slide, please. So key to all of this is about making the case for investment. It's about demonstrating the benefit to adopting the asset management approach. It's about demonstrating long-term funding between 10 and 30 years. And it's actually identifying what current level of funding is needed using some of the constraints explained and also some of the tools, and also how this can be achieved at the lowest life cycle cost. Each highway authority using this approach or using this framework tends to then develop their own approach in terms of collecting data and deterioration modelling. Next slide, please. You can go into the next slide. Okay, well, I was going to talk about a case study I have here for Oldham Council that actually applies some of the principles I've been talking about in terms of making the case for investment and actually using the HMEP Lifecycle Toolkit. You can actually read that at your leisure when you get the slides. There's no particular detail in there that I haven't explained already in the presentation. Can you move on to the last slide, please? Right, next slide. Yeah, so the final slide, back one. Right, the final slide. In the UK, there's no standard approach to financial planning. It is delivered, though, within a framework that I explained in this presentation. Good financial planning requires good data, good, robust, reliable data. Long-term financial planning of public sector is constrained by the way funding is allocated, and I've explained the challenge of annualisation of funding. Government has now moved on from this and has started to ring-fence funding for asset management, from which efficiency savings can be delivered. Publicly available tools such as HMEP Toolkit I've explained are available. The Highways England in England has actually received a long-term settlement of £15 billion, from which it can develop its own financial plans, from which it's challenged to deliver a 20% saving over long term. So finally, making the case for funding relies on demonstrating the benefits of asset management and long-term financial planning, and how this is actually undertaken is key to that. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Alan. Again, this is Matt Hardy. What we're going to do right now, so that concludes our presentations for today. So thank you to all of our presenters, even those that can't be with us at this time, because they're sleeping, hopefully. But now it's the time for Q&A. So again, please use the Q&A functionality within the webinar toolbar to ask any questions that you may have. We do have some that I'm going to go through now. So we have a few questions, and then we have sort of one more thought that I'll bring up, which I don't think we have an answer for, which includes the involvement of MPOs and such. But the first specific question, well, we have one for the first one for Chad. It gets into bicycle and sort of pedestrian infrastructure. So it says, for Chad, I noticed that one asset class you included in your plan was bike ped. What performance measure do you use to report condition or service for this asset class or for this type of asset class? Chad?
That's a good question. We don't have, I can't tell you a specific performance goal objective that we have now for bike ped stuff. We are looking at customer service levels. We have an asset registry and a schedule to bring assets and infrastructure supporting things like bike ped online. Right now we're focusing on bridges and pavements plus a couple other assets that are highly mature. I would say that probably for bike ped we'd be looking at customer service levels, identifying the high priority bike routes and making sure that they have enough shoulder width. I think that's where we're going with bike ped, but it is a work in progress right now.
Okay, thanks. I know that the whole bike pedestrian issue is a big one for both AASHTO and I know USDOT. So how do we incorporate that into asset management plans? I think will be a very interesting question to ask.
So can I interrupt there just to give you a UK perspective on that?
Sure. Go ahead.
In the UK, cycleways and footways as well, but not necessarily the two, and how you measure them and how you report levels of service aren't necessarily separated. But they are recognised as part of funding from government. So there is specific funding as part of the capital maintenance allocation from Department of Transport for those. I think perhaps more importantly, we have two methods of measurement we use for footways and cycleways in the UK. We have something what we call the FNS, which is the Footway Survey, Footway Network Survey, which is undertaken by foot primarily. And we have something else that's called the Course Visual Inspection, but it's undertaken by vehicle. And we also have a similar inspection then that's done by bike for cycleways that you can't get access to from footways or from the road. And from that, obviously, we report the percentage of footways, cycleways, or whatever need of maintenance. And from that, we deliver our levels of service. So those methods of measurement are nationally recognised ways of doing it. Obviously, each authority would develop their own level of service from those measurements.
Great. Thanks, Alan. There's one for you. I'll sort of follow up here. I think in your presentation, so the question has to deal with the difference between future performance and then customer experience as they relate to financial plan considerations of benefits or impacts. And the question is, can you sort of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. So where do we start? I think obviously when you're developing financial plans, what you're developing as part of that is developing performance targets. So you're trying to deliver a particular performance target for a particular sum of money. Performance targets then are determined if we just look at the carriageway network rather than the rest of it. So there would be certain approaches. For example, if you know you want to enhance the customer experience and make sure a road isn't potholed, what you'd actually be doing then is adopting the right maintenance treatments to actually prevent those potholes happening. And particularly what you'd be doing is adopting preventative maintenance techniques. So then when you're developing your life cycle planning, what you would be doing is actually putting more of those treatments in key areas to make sure that the customer expectations are maintained. I think just picking on customer expectations, we have quite two levels. Well, let's just focus at the local road level. We have quite sophisticated customer information at local road level. So most local authorities, when they're developing their financial plans, will know what the key areas that customers are concerned with. And in many ways, those come down to two things. They come down to potholes, of course, because that's the most visibly formed part of a road in terms of defect. But they also come down to things like street lighting and so forth, which is also a key challenge for local authorities because customers like street lighting, particularly if they've got it at the moment. So that customer expectation, so for example, if the authority recognises and benchmarks where it might be against its comparator authorities as being poor, what it would be doing then as part of the financial planning is developing maintenance strategies around improving those areas, but actually scoring low in terms of customer satisfaction. I hope that answers the question.
Great. I I think it does, but if there's follow-on, I think, is it okay if people follow up with you, Alan?
Very happy to do that. Happy to give you my email address. That's no problem.
Okay. One other question for Chad, and it has to do with the bridge maintenance funding. And the question is, why is it such a low priority? I think in the presentation it was sort of ranked a little lower.
Yeah, what I was showing in one of the graphs was that our bridge maintenance program was zeroed out in a sense. What that was we're taking care of our bridges and preserving our bridges under our maintenance and operations program under separate funds, and we also have preservation projects that are going out underneath those interstate and state highway and town highway bridge programs. So there's preservation activities going on there. It was at a particular time that they had tried to put preservation activities in a separate program, but we kind of moved away from that. And I just wanted to show our budget committee that we're no longer using that program. So, you know, is it their desire to keep it, or do they want us to start showing what we're spending for preservation in that fund, the allocation?
Okay. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here. There are a few other questions that came in, but it's 3:32 right now. I kind of want to ask this one and have Steve respond to it, and I think have Chad sort of respond to it, because it's a very, I think, a uniquely American or U.S. issue right now, and it has to do with MAP 21 and then MPOs. And it comes from a gentleman, Benjamin Brackett. I'm not sure if you're from an MPO or if you're from a state DOT, but it's an area that all the states and all the MPOs are going to have to be addressing at some point. And it has to do with the MPO involvement in the asset management sort of planning process and how everything comes together. I'll just read the comment here, and if other people have thoughts about this, please feel free to sort of give me, send me an email, contact me, or contact Steve Gay. But MAP 21 requires MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, to better integrate asset management planning into their long-range transportation planning processes. What do you think are or will be the major differences between traditional asset management financial plans and financial strategies that MPOs will be required to prepare for the long-range transportation plan? Perhaps less detail, different analyses. Keep in mind that many MPOs do not own or operate infrastructure. As much of the detail is not available to them, or perhaps it may not be as important. I spent 2 weeks in Australia and New Zealand sort of learning from them what they were doing with asset management, and they were talking about their locals. It's very different there than here in the U.S., where their locals, when they talk about locals, I think in many of the international countries, our friends abroad, those local agencies really own, manage, and operate much of the assets. But here in the U.S., when we talk about locals, oftentimes we're talking about MPOs, these sort of planning organizations that really, as Benjamin said, they don't own assets. They don't maintain the physical assets. That's a function of the state DOT, but as part of this overall planning process for metropolitan areas, they still have to be involved in that sort of, that overarching planning process. It's a question that I think many of us are going to have to address as part of MAP 21 implementation and the rulemaking. But I guess I wanted to, Chad, I'm not sure what you guys were thinking about up there in Vermont when it comes to MPO involvement, and then I turn it over to Steve to see if he has any thoughts about this or anything. But not to put you guys on the spot, but Chad, any thoughts?
No, that's okay. I think Vermont's fairly unique than some other areas in that we've only got one MPO, and it's in our Burlington, Chittenden County area, and there's probably 75,000 people. It's not a large population based by any stretch, but I think our approach is we're developing our TAMP internally, and then we're going to, once we get that where we want it, we're going to be engaging the MPOs, and we're starting to engage them in the conversation of performance measures and performance targets. We know the rules aren't finalized yet, but we're having a conversation on the NHS, what should be on the NHS, what shouldn't be on the NHS, and how that might impact condition and or reduce flexibility and future spending, where the MPO maybe would be directing some of their spending. If the NHS is robust and maybe it doesn't have to be. If it can be a little bit leaner, there might free up some flexibility there and how they prioritize which projects they're working on. But we're just starting to kind of get in touch with the MPO right now.
Okay. Steve, anything you want to add to it?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little different approach. You know, I'm talking about asset management in general. We talk about the MAP 21 requirements where it says, well, a state DOT shall develop a risk-based asset management plan for the NHS to improve or preserve the condition of the assets and performance of the system. In some states, the locals own few of the NHS routes. Some states, it's a more substantial part. MPO's role is they probably don't own any of the assets, but it's working closely with the locals and, of course, with the state. I'm going to go back to the asset management framework. Inventory, condition, risk, managing the assets for the whole life, financial plan and investment strategies. I think it's important for the MPO to work closely with the locals to have a good handle on the condition of the assets. And it may not just be pavement and bridges. What assets are important for the locals? Maybe signals, ITS, etc. Now, looking at the role of the MPO in coordinating the transportation, etc. Help sell the message. What are the financial needs, and what does it look like the money available is going to be? And working closely with the locals in the state in developing those investment strategies. I think the key is remembering the investment strategy part of this is what comes out of the asset management planning process is to work closely with the state and the locals playing that very role. What are important, and working together to come up with that. So that financial planning is getting maybe more detailed than what the state alone would capture, because you're including from the MPO side, locals, and the non-state owned roads, the local roads, to get a better picture of needs and coming up with a financial plan, money needed, money coming in, and coming up with investment strategy. Back to you, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So I have, by my clock, about 3:40. A few other questions came in, but I'm going to have those be answered offline just to respect people's time. So with that, excuse me, I want to turn it over to Yana Park, who's going to close us out.
All right. So our next webinar will be held on October 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll have a title and list of presenters confirmed shortly. Most likely the topic will be on risk management, kind of the round 2, because we had a risk management webinar about a year ago. You'll hear about it soon. We'll have the next 4 webinars on the schedule, so you'll be able to register for those in a very short while. So, so if you have additional requests for topics, please send them to Matt or Steve, and we'll get them into the schedule. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to the